So that is one aspect of what I wanted to talk to you about. The other thing is, before we dive into IoT, IoT is a topic that is a little bit amorphous and is very new for a lot of folks who don't live and breathe in the tech world, kind of like we do here at FPF. So I thought it would be useful to kind of define that, to explain what we're talking about, and to kind of level set before we have the conversation. So IoT, or the Internet of Things, refers to a wide range of technologies that are kind of broadly connected to the internet. So in the general consumer space, what that means is it's talking about things like watches, appliances, door locks, cars, things like that, that are all connected wirelessly or otherwise to the internet. And so in the classroom, and I have to say thanks to Sonja Trainor, who's going to be on the call here for some of this intel. In the classroom, what folks have been seeing is things like Fitbits and smart fabrics, self-driving vehicles, always-on voice assistants like Alexa, surveillance cameras, HVAC controls. These sorts of things are becoming more and more common in schools, and raise kind of a whole host of issues that we'd like to talk to you guys about today. So with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and kick things off to our first speaker, Kerry Gallagher. Kerry, I have you unmuted now, and just kind of as an introduction, Kerry is an assistant principal at St. John's Prep and works with ConnectSafely, a wonderful organization, and she's based up in New England. So Kerry, do you want to go ahead and take it away?
Absolutely. So I was thrilled to be invited to join this webinar today. I've had the opportunity to work with Future Privacy Forum to collaboratively develop some materials around student data privacy, specifically targeted to teachers. And I think IoT is sort of the next cutting edge thing. As you mentioned, we're seeing students come into class with smartwatches on as young as 6th grade. They're already coming in with smartwatches, and I mean, and younger than that, they're coming in with smart devices on their wrist that parents are adding so that they can track their location and they can track their steps. And a lot of companies are even producing these devices specifically targeting children so that they have certain safety measures on them that parents feel comfortable with. And so, you know, even elementary age students are coming into school with those on their wrists. And I think schools are working hard to try to catch up and develop policies that sort of both respect the parents' choices, but make sure that they're protecting students' interests while they're in the classroom, and making sure that students are able to focus on the learning that's supposed to be happening too. There's one really great story that I wanted to share about the implementation of a Google Home in a 5th grade classroom. And this is from a teacher in my state in Massachusetts. Her name is Raina Friedman, and she works at Jordan Jackson Elementary in Mansfield Public Schools. And I made sure I spoke with her so she knows I'm sharing her story today. And she, over the first several weeks of school, has implemented Google Home in her 5th grade class. And I like the process that she used, although I think in some communities they might not be ready for this kind of implementation, but I'm gonna kind of share her story with you. First of all, she started thinking about this last spring and developed a pretty comprehensive plan over the summer. She made sure that she spoke with her school and district leaders about it. She also shared her plan with the parents of her 5th graders and answered all of their questions about her intentions for the program and the pedagogical reasons behind it. The biggest need that she thought the Google Home was going to fill was that her classroom is not one-to-one, and when a student has a question that they want to look up the answer to, rather than forcing them to wait or asking them to do the time-consuming task of grabbing a Chromebook, opening it, signing in, opening a browser, figuring out how to phrase a question, typing it into a search engine, sifting through all the answers, she thought that the Google Home voice assistant would allow her students to really get the information they needed faster so that they could keep moving and learning together. So what she did, first of all, is asked her students if they knew what a Google Home was and what its purpose was, and asked what it might be able to help with in the classroom. And they came up with some answers, and she had to help them learn some of the purposes of a Google Home and taught them about that. And then she had them read through her district's responsible use policy for all technology. and learn what all of the language meant around student responsibility with those devices and programs, and then ask them to develop their own responsible use policy specific to the Google Home. And this was a several day lesson and process with revisions. And I think what I really like about this process is that not only did she teach them about the purpose of this example of IoT, but also taught them about how privacy and safety protocols are put in place by districts, and asked them to have a say in how they were going to be developed for themselves in their classroom. And then they developed specific like classroom norms, for instance, around how the Google Home was going to be used and how it would not be used. The kinds, they learned, she taught them the skill of how to ask it a question so that they would get the answer that they want. She taught them that sentence construction. And then they read up on whether this voice assistant was in fact always listening. And the students decided for themselves that as a rule, they want the Google Home unplugged unless it's being used, and that anytime a student wants to use it, he would have to make sure that he told her that he was going to use it and let her know what the question was going to be. And then she filled in the parents on all of this information and made sure that there weren't any parents who had concerns that hadn't been answered yet. And so she's implemented the Google Home in her classroom now for the last several weeks, and pretty successfully with sort of the buy-in and deep understanding of the students, the parents, and the school leadership. I will say she's a pretty innovative and responsible and really thoughtful teacher. I'm not sure how many teachers would have developed a process with this kind of depth, but it is really impressive. And so that's sort of a really great deep study of a case. But I'm happy to talk more about some other examples like you mentioned before, Tyler, as the conversation continues.
Sure, great. And I think that's a good place to kind of leave that and pass over to Diane, because I think it's a good use case to get everyone thinking. And so now we can kind of hear from a little bit of a different perspective. So Diane, I just pulled you off of mute. So, and for the folks on the phone who don't know Diane, Diane Doersch is in the technology office at the Green Bay area Public School District. So please go ahead and take it away, Diane.
An information officer here in Green Bay. I'm a former classroom teacher and then became director of technology in another school district, and now here am in Green Bay. I'm appreciative of Kerry's case study, because she really did outline a very proactive teacher who did a lot of, is doing a lot of things right regarding making sure that students know, with an acceptable use policy, what their responsibilities are, and that parents are also informed and, moving through a process together. As a person, I'm one of the people who has to review policy. And this is the part, I guess, that I want to talk about, because in Green Bay, because we've got about 21,000 students, we have a process as well. So when a teacher wants to use a technology like that, some of the new IoT stuff, we have a process. And, a district purchase is one thing, but sometimes school districts and individual schools get funding, or even teachers get funding. And so anytime something is not purchased by the Department of Technology, and it's technology which would be on our network in some way, we've got something called the Technology Acquisition Form. And the first thing that we do is have the teacher work with their principal, and they have to outline the importance of the device or the technology in the classroom. How is it going to help students learn? Because if it's not going to help students learn, then we don't really want to support it. But as we go through this process and that form is filled out, we ask a lot of questions. Who's going to support it? how are you going to sustain this, because we ain't replacing it when it gets broken, and those types of things. But then in my study, as our technology resource coordination team reviews things, we take a look at privacy and keeping students' data and information private. And I have to tell you that we have had some requests for IoT type devices. And it's not that we're the Department of No, because we very much try not to be. But I do have to say this is a new area for us. We've had some requests for personal voice assistants, and we've really taken a close look at policy, at terms of service, and when I say policy, privacy policies of the company that is creating it. And they are, like Kerry said, even gearing these things, these items, IoT items, toward children and their parents. And at this point, we've continued to have a lot of conversation, because I have a question like with a voice assistant, and maybe there are people out even listening right now who have an answer to this, but there's a short time when a voice is held within that voice assistant, and that constitutes a record, a student record. And so what does that look like? If it's a student record, the company who is holding on to the student record is a school official. And I know we've got attorneys here and things, so there are a lot of people who know more than I do about this. But when you become a school official, you have responsibilities. And so what we do is, we reach out to the company and we request that they sign our FERPA non-disclosure agreement. And that says, that they're not going to market to our students. If they're using things for research, they'll de-identify. If they change their terms of service, we have to be notified. When we cease using them or their product, they'll get rid of our data. It's all those types of things. And I'm having difficulty getting signatures on some of these all these IoT devices up to this point. So, I continue to question, I continue to ask, how is student data being used? Because chances are these IoT devices may use, voice activation or video or movement and location and those types of things. So those are student records. And so how are we getting our providers, our solution providers, to understand that we need assurances if these devices are going to be used in our schools? So that's where we sit with policy and figuring things out at this point.
Okay, thank you for your insight, Diane. One quick program note before we go ahead and go to our next speaker. I wanted to let you all know that please feel free to continue asking questions in the Google Doc. We're going to ask all of those kind of at the end, just to kind of keep things a little bit more organized, and so that we can draw on the experience and expertise of all of our speakers at once. So please keep posting them there as they come up, and we will get them asked. So, okay, so we are actually going to now go to our next speaker, Susan Bearden, who I am trying to unmute. There we go. So Susan, we should have you on now. Just by way of introduction, Susan is working with FPF on our training initiative and is also the Chief Innovation Officer with the Consortium for School Networking. So Susan, do you want to go ahead and take it away?
Sure. Can everyone see my screen now?
Yeah, we can see you coming through.
Perfect. Okay, great. Well, thank you for having me, Tyler. It's great to be here. Just wanted to start off by just making sure everyone knows I am I am the Chief Innovation Officer for the Consortium for School Networking, although in this particular presentation, I am not representing CoSN. I am speaking in my personal capacity. CoSN does have some terrific privacy resources that I will talk about under later in this webinar. That's under the leadership of Lynette Attai, and definitely something worth checking out. So anyway, just what I wanted to talk a little bit about was some things that you should consider, well, 5 things, for instance, that teachers should consider before you're using AI in the classroom or just any piece of education technology. And the first step, and Diane mentioned this in her presentation, is to don't sign up for an app or a service without checking with your school or district. You know, some districts like Diane's have systems in place to vet educational apps and websites to ensure that they comply with state and federal privacy laws and align with curriculum guidelines, and that they have signed contracts with other vendors. So it's important to check with your district first, especially when you're looking to implement a newer technologies like AI. This is new space. This is something that a lot of people are trying to figure out. And so it's important that you check with your school or district leadership to find out, to make sure that it's okay for you to be using that tool. The second thing, and I think this is really important, especially with regards to AI, is don't assume an app or a tool is safe to use in the classroom just because you heard about it at a conference. And you know, a perfect example of this is the use of voice activated assistants like Amazon Echo or like Alexa or Google Home in the classroom. I was impressed with the process and thank you very much for Kerry for sharing the story of the teacher who had implemented Google Home in the classroom. I'll be honest, I'm not a fan of using voice activated assistants in the classroom yet, because the current tools that are out there are consumer devices. They're not designed for education, and there are privacy concerns with regard to COPPA and FERPA. But having said that, if you are going to be implementing those tools in the classroom, the thoughtful manner in which that particular teacher did it in that story that Kerry shared is how you want to do it. But my concern is that educators will hear about a story like this and they say, oh, well, everybody's using you know, a voice assistant like Alexa or Google in the classroom, and therefore I can just go ahead and implement it without thinking about the privacy concerns. So it's very important that you know, do your research and you think twice before you implement it just because you heard about it or other people are using it, because just because other people are using a tool doesn't mean that you necessarily should. And the third step is to make sure that you understand the implications of click-wrap agreements. And just to explain a little bit what click-wrap agreements are, is that whenever you sign up for an app or a website, you usually have to click a box or a button that says you agree to a long list of terms and conditions that most people never read, but which you need to read, and that's called a click-wrap agreement. And you've probably done it dozens of times for websites and apps that you use in your personal life. But when you do this for EdTech tools in the classroom, there are some significant legal implications, because as a teacher, when you click that button, you've entered into a legally binding contract on behalf of your students and your school. So before you do that, you need to review the service's terms of conditions and privacy policies to understand how it uses student data and make sure that they comply with state and federal privacy laws. And so that's the next step, which would be to read the terms of service and the privacy policy. And a lot of times, some districts have a vetting system in place, and they will be the ones responsible for evaluating these privacy policies in terms of service. And that's the ideal circumstance. But there are lots of districts who don't have those systems in place. And if they don't, that responsibility is going to fall on you, the classroom teacher. And in addition to there being many different state laws that that govern student privacy, you also need to be aware of the implications of FERPA, which is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, and COPPA, which is the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. And I believe that Sonja is going to be speaking more about those later in the presentation. but you want to make sure that you are going to be complying with these laws when you are using the apps and tools in the classroom. I want to give a shout out if you're wondering, well, how can I learn more about this? I'm not a lawyer, but I want to have a better understanding of these tools. And this goes down to my 5th bullet, which is to educate yourself about student privacy. Kerry mentioned earlier that she had collaborated with ConnectSafely and FPF on a terrific guide. It's called the Educator's Guide to Student Data Policy. I would highly recommend that you just do a Google search for it and find it. It's a terrific guide for teachers that kind of explains this complex legal language in plain English. I also want to give out a shout out to the Utah State Board of Education and David Saleh. They have a terrific and very entertaining YouTube playlist covering privacy basics for educators. So a few of the videos are specific to the state of Utah, but most are applicable to all educators, and they are they really do a terrific job explaining the concepts in plain English. I know David is on the webinar today, so let's give a shout out to David and his colleagues in Utah for this great series of videos. And if you just go to YouTube, I would just recommend go to YouTube and do a search for Utah State Board of Education privacy, and you'll probably find them. But they're terrific, and they do such a great job of explaining, kind of breaking down, like, what is FERPA, what are the exceptions that might apply for educators, what is an educational record, what's kind of the intersection of ed tech and educational records, and that Diane also mentioned earlier, and it's a really terrific series. And there's also, if you go to Google, there's also a video called Student Privacy 101 FERPA for Parents and Students, and that's from the U.S. Department of Education, and that is also a really terrific data that app that, or terrific video that helps explain what FERPA is all about. Just one thing I want to make you aware of, especially when we're moving in this, and this is true with all ed tech tools, but also when we're in, especially in the AI space, is that a lot of times you're going to have conflicting privacy policies. And for instance, I just want to share with you a service that I learned about that works with Alexa, that an Echo, and is called Ask My Class. And they were heavily advertising at ISTE, and if you look at their website, they're definitely marketing towards the K-5 space. They have several teacher ambassadors who are, you know, some of whom are definitely K-5 teachers. But if you read their privacy policy, it explicitly says, and you have to click through a couple screens to get there, Ask My Class is not intended for use by children under the age of 13. So this is something you have to really be careful of. This is one of the reasons why it's so important to read privacy policies, is that you want to make sure that you are using tools that are complying with COPPA, and that you are, you know, helping keep your students safe. So always make sure you read the privacy policies. I know it's not always something that a lot of teachers want to do, and like I said, in an ideal world, your district will have someone who'll do that vetting for you. But if they don't, you know, please take the time to read them, because it's important. For just a couple of practical considerations, if you're going to be using voice assistants in the classroom, and it sounded like from the story that Kerry was relating that the teacher and her students and their administration had really been very thoughtful and intentional in how they were using the tools. But the U.S. Department of Education has some guidance that I'll talk about a little later called FAQs on photos and videos under FERPA. And it's probably kind of the the U.S. Department of Education hasn't issued any formal guidance or publications regarding to artificial intelligence like voice assistants in the classroom. However, this document is one that I think relates very closely to what the same policy considerations would be. So if you're looking at using a voice assistant in the classroom, one, you want to treat the voice assistant like a third person sitting in the classroom. So if you wouldn't say it in front of you know, someone who's not in your school building, who's just visiting the classroom, don't say it when the voice assistant is powered on. And the second rule based on this guidance would be don't use the voice assistant in ways that allows the student voice to be directly associated with an individual student, because biometric data is protected under FERPA, and a student's voice would be considered biometric data. And the third tip would be to power off the voice assistant when discussing personally identifiable information or confidential student information, PII, with others. And I was thrilled to hear, Kerry, that the classroom had come up with their own norms regarding the device, and that when it wasn't being used, they were going to unplug it, and that they were actually going to make sure the teacher was aware when they plug the device in. If you're going to be using voice assistants in the classroom, that's what you want, that's the kind of thing you want to be doing, because I don't know if you heard this in the news, and this is a true story, an Oregon woman discovered that her Alexa was she was having conversations with her husband, and the Alexa had recorded them and was sending them to a random work contact in her address book. And there are some folks who might say, oh, well, that's kind of, that's just a one-off thing. That's not something that could happen. That's not likely to happen. But if you are the child whose personal information is being discussed when that happens, it doesn't matter if it's a fairly unusual occurrence. That's a pretty significant privacy violation. So I just wanted to share this story just so that folks are aware that this is one of the reasons why you need to be careful and make sure that the voice activated device is actually powered off if you are going to be discussing any sort of confidential information in the classroom. And here are some federal resources to help you on your student data privacy journey. As I mentioned, the FAQs on photos and videos under FERPA, if you're, I find this to be a really terrific reference in terms of helping to understand sort of the intersection of voice recordings with federal law. These were really originally designed to talk about photos and actually videos like security videos, but they really serve as a helpful reference. So I would encourage you to take a look at that. And also just want to give a shout out to the U.S. Department of Education's Privacy Technical Assistance Center just in general. They have tons of super helpful resources and are very knowledgeable and willing to help, and they are located at studentprivacy.ed.gov. And then I just wanted to share with you from the Consortium for School Networking some AI and privacy resources that are available. CoSN, if you are a CoSN member, CoSN does have, it's members only, but they do have an excellent brief on artificial intelligence in education. And they also have an EdTech Next report on artificial intelligence that's really kind of talking about the future uses of artificial intelligence in education. But for those of you who aren't members, CoSN still has some really terrific resources in their Protecting Privacy and Connected Learning Toolkit. And that toolkit, it contains lots of guidance on how key laws operate together, gives you suggested contract language, explanations of metadata and data de-identification, click wrap agreements, and additional privacy related resources, including the ones that are listed here on this screen. So whether you are grappling with questions about AI and student data privacy, or just kind of student data privacy in general, these are terrific resources, and the ones on this page are open to the public. So that's my part of the presentation, and I believe now we're going on to Sonja.
Great, thank you, Susan, really appreciate it. Just before we turn things over to Sonja, I wanted to let everyone know that those resources that you just saw in Susan's presentation will all be sent out to you as part of a follow-up after this webinar. So don't worry if you weren't able to write everything down, or if you want to follow up with anything specific. You'll have that in your inbox very soon. And then if there's anything else that you'd like to follow up with, please feel free to send me an email, and I'll be happy to connect you to resources to the extent that I can. So with that, I'd like to turn things over to Sonja Trainor. Sonja, I just unmuted you. And for folks on the phone, Sonja is the Managing Director of Legal Advocacy for the National School Boards Association and runs the Council of School Attorneys. So Sonja, you want to go ahead and take it from here?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Tyler, and welcome everyone to this really informative webinar. And please do tell me if you have trouble hearing me. I'm really honored to be on the line today with Kerry and Diane and Susan, who are obviously very well versed in this particular area of school law. It is one, of course, of many issues that school attorneys deal with on a daily basis. And sometimes in the hustle of everything else they are talking about, transgender student bathroom use, for instance, technology is sometimes not what they are not as well versed in technology as they might otherwise be. So attorneys themselves depend on folks like Diane and Kerry, our clients' school districts, to really inform them about the technology. And what I found when I was preparing for this talk was that attorneys are starting to get into the discussions with their clients about how to frame policy around Internet of Things, how to add them, for instance, as devices on policies they already have. And the overall, as we'll get into in a minute, the overall advice is to hold off. So, and this is the constant tug of war we have, as folks on the phone well know, between the sort of legal advice, which is to hold off for a while until we know what the regulatory framework is going to look like. But in the meantime, we have brilliant teachers and administrators who want to innovate and bring every tool they can to bear in the classroom. So we try to get information out to our attorneys and to the school board members to let them know the parameters, and I'm going to try to give you a bit of that today. I would recommend that you take a look at the NSBA site for some pretty basic guidance on school data security, data privacy for students, and data security in schools. That's at nsba.org. And NSBA has initiated a cyber secure schools page that has a bunch of resources on it, including a really great video, I believe from Cisco, involving a hacker played by an actor who was able to tunnel into a company using the company's HVAC system. So when we talk about Internet of Things, of course, security is a big issue, and we'll get to that in a minute. But really quickly, I want to mention the federal legal framework for digital privacy in schools. As has been alluded to, the two main laws that school attorneys are going to look at least at the federal level, are FERPA and COPPA. And I'll get into those in a minute. We are not talking about CIPA, I knew you all were asking, which is the Children's Internet Protection Act, and that is the requirement that K through 12 schools and libraries that take federal funds protect children from harmful online content through filtering. That's not sort of where we are right now when we're talking about the sort of risks that attorneys are concerned about with regard to Internet of Things. We're largely talking about FERPA and COPPA. So FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, is the broad federal law, I'm sure all of you know, largely intact since 1974. So as you can imagine, there have been all sorts of discussions, and FPF and Amelia Vance there have been involved in those conversations about updating FERPA, and that may happen, but while we have the current law, it's still outlined as it was in 1974. The simple idea is that educational institutions that receive federal funding may not have a policy or practice of permitting the release of education records or personally identifiable information in them without consent of parents. It's a very simple idea. It also allows parents access to those records. However, there are all kinds of exceptions, and the one that we hear most about with respect to ed tech, when a school turns over a portion of its tools to technology, is the school official exception. And that exception has been tweaked around the edges in recent years So a school can disclose education records to a school official, which now includes an online service provider, under really specific conditions. The online service provider has to be performing an educational service that the district would otherwise provide, and has to be under direct control of the district. The vendor can only use the data or the records for those educational purposes, which it originally contracted for. So that school official exception is the one that is often invoked. So that has been tinkered with, or again, around the edges to make it clear that schools can do that. And the Privacy Technical Assistance Center at the Department of Ed has done its very best to release guidance as those regulatory changes came out. And I too would join Susan in just commending you to that website, studentprivacy.ed.gov, I believe. It has all kinds of useful guidance, including the one about video and photos, which is the most recent. But FERPA is an interesting character because it looms over the whole framework of how we interact with student information in schools, but there is no private right of action under the statute. A school, a parent or family or student couldn't bring an action for money damages against a school district for not complying with FERPA. What could happen is they could file a complaint, and then the Department of Education could investigate. And at the very end of a long procedure, a school district's funding could be withdrawn. That's never happened. So this framework that's been developed that schools really do adhere to does not have any sort of enforcement teeth as you might traditionally think of them. One thing I would note though, and the Department of Ed has been fairly clear on this, vendors that use student data as a school official can use non-personally identifiable information or de-identified data to create new products and services. So once a vendor has the data and it's de-identified, there's some question about whether FERPA would even apply to restrict its use. And I think that's one of the big concerns when we're talking about Internet of Things, that there's all kinds of data being collected by all kinds of devices, not just going up to a vendor, a particular vendor and his or her servers, but going to the world at large, at least potentially. That and all these devices collecting all these data become big data. And then even though it's de-identified, we all are being tracked and watched, and our locations taken note of and all of that, which just kind of rubs folks the wrong way. So I have to think that this Internet of Things is the next big thing, and we are going to have more questions about it. But in the meantime, let's get back to the framework we were talking about, FERPA. I'm going to move into COPPA, which of course is the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. And COPPA has restrictions on operators. So operators of commercial websites or apps that knowingly collect information or target children under 13. These operators are required to get parental consent in some situations, particularly if they aim to use the children's data for their own commercial purposes. Now, schools may grant that consent on behalf of parents, and all of that is sort of guided by guidance from the FTC through an FAQ. It is not done through what we would traditionally think of as regulation. So the FTC continues to revise its frequently asked questions document, and that's how we got to kind of get the contours of what schools can do as far as granting permission on behalf of parents when they want kids to use certain online tools. So moving into Internet of Things. Tyler gave a list of some of the things that schools are seeing, including the fabric, which I have not seen in person yet, but apparently Ralph Lauren makes a fabric that collects biometric data just like a Fitbit does, but you wear it. All kinds of athletic possible uses there. I have also heard about sensors that collect data in football helmets. Since my son is now out for the entire season with a knee injury, I guess I won't be worrying about that in the football helmets, but I like that idea going further. And then things like HVAC controls, of course, web-based door access controls. Those are the things that are becoming very ubiquitous, along with security cameras in schools that are connected to larger networks. But the two things that our attorneys nationwide are kind of seeing the most questions on are wearable devices, so things like Fitbits and Apple Watches and fabric and even jewelry, in addition to the always on and recording devices. So as the other panelists have mentioned, Alexa, and similar devices, Google Home, that are kind of always listening unless you unplug them, which is brilliant. And then you're concerned about a number of things, but they also can be very useful. It turns out that Alexa data has been used, after subpoena, of course, in murder trials to solve crimes because she's always on listening. So that, I suppose, is one benefit. Another really beneficial use with some huge privacy implications is these counseling dolls, dolls that children are able to speak directly to in a counseling sort of setting if the child is uncomfortable talking to an adult. So the counseling dolls gather and record what the child says, and then that information is analyzed later. So what attorneys are looking at are how this data is handled at three different stages. One is collection, so how it's collected and whether we have the appropriate permissions for that. How the data is maintained and used. And that is where we get into whether it's for a commercial purpose, is it de-identified, all of that. And then data analysis. And that's where we see some of this artificial intelligence type analysis that takes place way off in the cloud or somewhere else coming in. And the two biggest areas of concern, of course, are intrusion into privacy of those who are surrounding any particular device, and then compromise of the data that's collected. So if you do have a chance to visit the NSBA site and go to our Cyber Secure Schools page, you'll see this video, which is a dramatic interpretation of a hack that took place at a company. And the way that the hacker got in was through the HVAC system. And that system was wired into the company's network. He was able to see blueprints, et cetera, that allowed him to share those with a competitor. But if we think about the amount and sensitivity of data that schools collect, that is, the security is a big concern, especially given that we know there are hackers out there looking for that kind of data. It is valuable and useful. So those are the concerns that attorneys are looking at. What I am hearing is that their general advice is to include mention of Internet of Things type devices in a district's acceptable use policy, in their policies on technology. and to list out examples such that they know them now, but to leave that definition of Internet of Things devices broad enough to encompass future devices. So what they are looking at is just requiring permission at the district level for any device to use the district's networks. If the student is using a different network, it's a little bit harder to control, but that is the advice we are generally seeing. And as I said before, attorneys are risk adverse. Technology is scary. We don't all know a lot about it. So attorneys are going to need to lean on folks like those on the call to understand exactly how these things work so that we can allow for innovation while still protecting against these risks. I think that's it for me, Tyler.
Great, I really appreciate it, Sonja. And actually that last point that you made is kind of a perfect segue into the first question that I wanted to ask kind of the combined group of all of you, which is when we're thinking about these devices coming in and being kind of more commonly used in the classroom, I mean, what's the upside? What is the potential of an IoT device when it's being used in the classroom? How could they be useful, or in your opinion, are they just kind of a gimmick or a fad? I mean, what have you been seeing? What have your experiences been? And just kind of, by the way, you guys should all be able to unmute yourselves if you want to weigh in on that.
Tyler, this is Kerry. I can weigh in on that for sure. The examples that I'm seeing in classrooms that I'm in every day and that I'm hearing from other teachers who I, connect with either at conferences or just through social media, are that it is, I guess every time there's a new technology implemented in the classroom, that Gimmick question comes up. So it's a question that educators are accustomed to fielding. I have to be honest, my first reaction to that is always a little bit of frustration when the question comes from someone who isn't an educator, because I think it's sort of questioning the professionalism of the educator. And it indicates like doubt that educators aren't automatically considering pedagogy before implementing any new practice, whether it involves technology or not. And my experience is that most professional educators do have that thought process every time they implement a new practice, including implementing a practice that includes a new technology like IoT. In the case of that I mentioned, the most common uses that the students have are asking questions about science, mostly because the materials that the district has provided for the teacher are outdated, and so they don't have access to the most updated information. And it's a huge time saver as compared to getting into a computer, like I mentioned before, signing in and asking the question. I'm a fan of the way the teacher actually rolls this out, because since the students have to ask permission to plug in the voice assistant, and then the teacher is there to hear the student ask the question and then here's the answer. As with when a teacher would help a student sort through, search engine results or sort through an article, the teacher is there to help the student sort out the information they get back from the assistant. Like, ooh, do you think that that's the whole answer? Does that really give you all the information you need? Do you need to ask another question to dig deeper? Is there another resource besides this voice assistant that would help us, learn more about this topic? And that would be, the process that a teacher would go through anytime that a student would use a new tactic or a new tool. Make sure that the student really is learning, is reaching those learning goals. So I think that's like my initial answer to the question, just as applied to the example that I mentioned. But even with the health tracking data, it's access to data that we didn't have access to before as educators, that we can turn around and show our students to help them understand the reasons behind the fitness and wellness learning that that is a part of their educational experience. So that's why it's useful there. I do have concerns about the fitness tracking equipment that schools might be requiring students to use as part of the programming. I haven't seen a case of that has made me entirely comfortable or that I would be on board with. I have seen schools use step trackers that are not part of the Internet of Things, that are not connected. And those use cases, I think, are sort of make me more comfortable. Yeah.
Any other thoughts from the panelists on kind of positive use cases? If not, I've got another question too.
It's Diane here. Personally, I absolutely love my iWatch and closing the circles on the movement and fitness and all of those types of things. And so I really do see some good and positive things. I mean, in hospitals, the fact that now we can monitor hearts without them being wired to something that goes to the wall, I think is awesome. And so the developments are just incredible, and they are designed for the good. I guess I would agree with Sonja that, you know, we're still learning about these things, and we're still trying to get some answers regarding, or I guess some assurances about the data and what's happening to the data when we talk about, you know, our students. And so there are a lot of good things out there, and I'm eager to see what the future will bring and how we're able to bring these two worlds together.
Yeah, and kind of following up on that, I kind of want to tee this up for all of you to take a swing at, which is kind of just the thought of, you know, when we're talking about IoT and use in classrooms, especially in the context of children who may be, you know, young or not really appreciate the implications of the technology that we're talking about here today. I mean, when does this technology cross the line from being useful and being positive into being creepier, into kind of raising your hackles as far as, you know, maybe things have gone a step too far? Or to kind of frame it a different way, you know, where's the line between compliance and between this kind of sense of having people track you, and, you know, how does that balance with the positive, you know, positive use cases that we've been talking about a little bit?
Tyler, this is Kerry again. I think for me, when we're talking about school-owned devices that are being used in the classroom, it's important that educators are able to have access to learning data or education data, but the idea of tracking a student's location through a device doesn't seem like it fits within that educational context. I have to say, we're talking about IoT that is owned by the school and being used by the teacher. But remember that a lot of the examples of IoT that are in classrooms are actually owned by the student and purchased by their parents. And those are the ones that are used for tracking location and fitness data and all of that the most often in schools. And so are there any implications for the teachers in those classrooms in terms of watching out for the other students in the room's privacy? Like when a student comes into the classroom with a phone or an Apple Watch and Siri is there, how can the teacher make sure that that isn't open and listening while the class is in session? Some schools have prohibited Apple Watches as a result of that. The school that I work has not done that, but I think that those are other questions that haven't really even been addressed yet, that sometimes the tracking isn't, we're not even just talking about what the school is doing, it's what the students are coming to the school with, that the school has to acknowledge is there in the classroom with them.
Yeah, Tyler, this is Sonja. I could jump in on that, and I appreciate that distinction that Kerry's making between school-owned devices and personal devices. A lot of the legal wrangling we're seeing does occur when it's a personal device and either an employee is wearing it or a parent is sending their child with it. If it has a recording function, it's a little bit easier usually of a legal case to be able to tell that parent, hey, we really can't have recording devices at school. Some states have eavesdropping laws that make it quite easy to say you know, you can't record a conversation with unless everyone consents. But districts are starting to put that into policy, that no recording devices are allowed at school. But it is much harder to regulate if they're coming in as personal devices.
And And so kind of as a follow-up for you, Sonja, but also for the other folks who want to weigh in, I mean, does that analysis change when we're talking, instead of about a recording device, when we're instead talking about tools like voice assistants, you know, Siri or Cortana that are in everyone's phones that, you know, may be used or useful in the classroom? I mean, but they come in on a student's kind of private device. Is there a best practice there? Are there legal questions that are raised that are different than just an out-and-out recording device in your kind of collective mind?
Well, this is Sonja. Yeah, I think so. And I'd love to hear what CoSN and Susan, you guys are recommending for best practice. But I'll just use the example of my kids' school. They have just restricted access to the internet in the school building because everyone had a device and it was just getting a little too out of control. So they, you know, you have to be on your cell, and it's not very consistent within the school building. But I do think there's a difference between something that's actually recording and something that's just on all the time. And I love the example of unplugging the Google Home until someone's actually using it. The kids came up with that. That's brilliant.
This is Susan. I'm just speaking from my own personal perspective here, but unless there's a really compelling reason to use Siri or Cortana, I would recommend having those features be turned off. I mean, I know I have Siri on my personal phone, but I have to press the button to activate it. I don't have it so that I just say, "Hey Siri," and then it automatically powers on. But I would say, what is the compelling educational reason for keeping those services activated? And if there isn't a compelling educational reason, then I would recommend just deactivating those. I'd be interested to hear what others have to say.
I think one thing that's really important is making sure that we're not just talking among the adults about all of this and why this is important. I think the process that Raina Friedman, the teacher I mentioned before, went through in educating her students about privacy and having them read the acceptable use policy and having them write their own responsible use policy, and also identifying, I mean, Raina used that educator guide to student data privacy to teach herself how to read privacy policies, and was able to pull out key sentences to show her fifth graders what they mean and what, you know, why the fact that that was in the policy and what that means, so that they could make that decision for themselves. So if adults are just making these decisions for children and then implementing them without explaining the reasoning or teaching them, they're missing out on teaching them this really important life skill that, in my opinion, is like a key literacy that should be a part of the programming at any school at this point.
Kerry, I'd just like to piggyback on what you're saying and say, first of all, amen, I agree with you. I think that your point about educating students about privacy and technology is critically important, and we are doing our students a huge disservice if we don't have these conversations with them, because the reality is, you know, a lot of these students have voice activated assistants at home and they're using them at home. And yes, the calculation changes a bit when it's the parent who's purchasing the device and they're using it in their personal home versus when it's being used in a school environment, because I think there are all sorts of laws and ethical considerations that need to be taken into consideration, especially when you're in your school environment. But these students have access to these tools at home, and you know, it's part of their lives. So it is very important that we include students in these conversations and make sure that we are educating them about about their privacy. And because I have always kind of maintained on a personal level that I think that student privacy is more at risk from their personal use of technology tools than it ever is or for the most part, than it could be in a school setting. or definitely that's definitely a big risk, because so many students are using these tools outside of school and they're not educated and the parents aren't educated. So I'm going to make a plug for including parents in the conversation as well, and educating them as well, because most parents don't know much about technology and privacy and Internet of Things and what are the privacy implications. So thank you, Kerry, for bringing up that point about including students, and I would add parents in the conversation.
So I have an anecdotal story that demonstrates your point, Susan. Raina told me that when she reached out to the parents and explained the process that she was going through with their children in order to implement Google Home, she shared with them all the different things that she had taught the students about the privacy policy and the terms of use and the acceptable use. And she got replies from, she said, like 5 or 6 parents who said, oh my gosh, I didn't know that my voice assistant in my home was doing all of these things. Like, thank you for teaching me about this. That's a part of the process.
Yeah, so I kind of want to pick up on a couple threads that Kerry, you and Susan have both kind of mentioned a few minutes ago, and Susan, you made I think what I thought was a really good point about kind of keeping the educational purpose in mind when you're deciding whether or not to use technologies. And Kerry, you kind of brought up the use of wearables and other kind of technologies in health in gym class, things like Fitbits to monitor biometric data, and I think Sonja, you touched on this as well. And I kind of wanted to put the question explicitly out there, which is, what are the privacy issues or the privacy concerns that are raised by the use of that technology?
I can say that as a parent, I have, my oldest is a 4th grader, and she wears a smartwatch that is one that's designed specifically for children, as we were talking about the different types of IoT devices that are marketed to children and parents. And I'm able to monitor her location, her fitness data through an app on my phone. And we did a lot of research before we purchased that device and made that decision, of course. But I would, as a parent, I would struggle being okay with the school tracking her health data or her location in that way. I feel as though I'm not sure that I would have to learn a lot more about the educational purpose behind them tracking that kind of data about my child.
Yeah, and I think that dovetails with another question I wanted to ask kind of all of you, but starting with Sonja, and that's kind of, what about Internet of Things devices for students with special needs? Are there special kind of considerations there or concerns there that you'd like to weigh in on?
Well, I can just give the example, and I think you all have heard from David Rubin, one of our members who's dealt with this. Again, the biggest issue we're seeing is parents who want to record their children's day because they're either concerned about instruction in some way, or the child is not verbal and can't explain what's happened during the day. And those are understandable concerns, of course. So, one device called AngelSense has been very prominent in schools, and our member David was able to reach an arrangement actually with the company whereby they agreed to some terms in their usual contract with schools that allows the school to turn off the recording device at times when there are other students around during classroom instruction, et cetera. So for special education students, students in special education programs, students with disabilities, schools are very aware of rules that require them to consider technology, especially communication needs. There's a whole separate set of laws on that. So it will be part of a conversation at an IUP meeting and a lot more involved discussion, but in the end, the laws on recording and the concerns about privacy are really similar. There is one decision out of the Supreme Court of out of the First Circuit Court of Appeals, a federal appellate court, on this topic that found that it was not, the device was not required as part of the student's education program. The parents had said that it should be required. So there is some evolving law on this, but it is very early.
Thanks. And Diane, you know, I kind of, the talk about kind of risk and risk assessments and all these different kind of contexts gets me thinking about how, you know, a district or might kind of assess the risk or tech or privacy impact assessment, you know, from a process perspective or from a substantive perspective when it comes to the Internet of Things. Like, does your kind of calculus change when we're talking about IoT versus other things that are coming into the to a district?
Yes, and that is because of the newness. I mean, if you think back to the old days, we kept everything nice and safe in our firewalls, right? We had applications on the server and students saved their work on the server and you could only access it in the district. But when the cloud came about, then it's like, oh, this is great. Our kids can access stuff in the district, outside the district, and all those other things. And that's when things started changing. Because then the solution providers said, well, we want to personalize this. We want to customize it so it is more matched to the student. And that's when, you know, requests for student rosters to come through so that each user had a name and those types of things. And while some of it could have been directory data, you know, the records that are produced because of that fall under FERPA. And that's where we've been, and we've built the process to handle those things. And so now when we're adding additional things like IoT and AI and things that are so new, what I've done is I've been very fortunate to have I've been in networks and consortia that are very helpful to me in connecting me with people in the know. And so, and some of them are in the group here, you know, Common Sense Media, Student Data Privacy Consortium, PTAC, and EdGov, Future Privacy Consortium. You know, those are, and there are many more, a data quality campaign. There are many more as well. But I found that there are a network of people. And so I can contact them and get, you know, what's been happening or other things I should be thinking about. And as you can tell, I'm still waiting for further information or need more understanding before we can be considering some of these more advanced things like voice assistants. I'm thinking of, we just purchased a product that has an iPad attached to the top, and it's like it rides around on a Segway. I don't want to start naming names here, but this allows for mobility of a homebound student to be able to drive around a class and a school as if they were actually present in school. And so we had to think really hard about that. Okay, who needs to give permissions for this? We are not recording this. And what do others who observe this need to understand? What kind of conversations do we need to have with our principals? You know, and that's how we handle newness. I guess we take a look at what are the risks, who needs to know new stuff, and you know, it's definitely collaboration with our legal counsel here, as well as within my network, talking to software experts who know the behind the scenes. And I think all of us working together and also sharing this information helps others advance as well. So I can't say enough about working not alone, but with a group of people so that you see all angles of things and can kind of get a pulse on really what's going on out there, what we should be thinking about. And then if you choose to advance, you know, what safeguards do you have in place? And so sharing those best practices is always good as well.
Yeah, and I want to kind of follow up on one of those kind of safeguards or best practices but in a more kind of particular context. And you know, I'm curious to know if you have any thoughts on how districts might deal with compromised security on IoT devices. I know that's something that might be a risk that you would consider when you're going through this. And I think Sonja alluded to the security aspects of IoT a little bit earlier. Do you know if there are any kind of best practices or ways that you can kind of mitigate the risk of an unsecured IoT device or that particular, you know, something happening in that particular context? And Diane, I'm throwing this at you, but if other folks have thoughts, feel free to weigh in as well.
Well, I think I would equate this to how do we security in general. You know, we contract out for penetration testing, and you know, some actually ask for, you know, for attempts within, you know, our educational realm to check and see where our gaps are. I would also say, and I was just talking to my team about this yesterday, about having language ready so that, you know, in practicing things very similar to potentially, you know, the breach protocol that you may have in your district. You know, how do you run that? What does communication look like? You want to be thinking about all these things ahead of time so that when it hits you, you're not scrambling to reason through things, try to communicate out, you know, and miss some big gaps there. I'm interested to hear what others have to say about this as well.
Yeah, hi, this is Susan. Yeah, you know, as a former school technology leader, you know, as you know, Diane mentioned, you can hire outside contractors to do penetration testing, and you can, or, you know, phishing emails, or to test other aspects of your cybersecurity. And I honestly don't know if there are companies that are, if that would be included under, like if Internet of Things devices would be included in that category, or if an Internet of Things device does not go through your network, like if it's on a, well, if it's on a 3G network, that would be totally separate. But that's a really complicated issue, and a really complicated issue. But yes, I would concur with Diane's point that it's important for districts to have really solid, you know, breach protection plans in place. And again, I'm going to just give a shout out to PTAC, studentprivacy.ed.gov. They've got some really terrific guidance for districts on developing policies and what to do in case of a data breach and work like that. And CoSN also has a cybersecurity initiative, and that has some resources that can help with cybersecurity in general. But those are really great questions, and I don't have all the answers.
Yeah, this is Sonja. I would say attorneys again are going to defer to the technology experts on this. We do have that data security guide on our website, which I sent around the link to, and one of the things that's suggested on there is a data governance plan that of course includes security breach. Also, you know, a source of a checklist or a best practice, although I absolutely would recommend what PTAC and CoSN have, is your insurance provider. If you're looking at protecting against the risk of a breach and you're looking into insurance, they will likely have a list of protocols you need to have in place. It's their business to research what is and remains big risks. I would also pay attention to guidance the FBI is putting out. They just put out one recently. They will alert people to risks that are acute at the moment, criminal activity that is happening now that we should be aware of.
Great, thanks. And just kind of for everyone to note quickly, I'm gonna kind of speed through the next couple questions a little bit because I want to cover as much ground as we can before we wrap up. And Kerry, I kind of wanted to change subjects a little bit and throw this next question at you. So, you know, and it has to do with kind of consent and parental opt-in. So I know you shared your case study, and in your case study, the teacher went out and did consult parents before using IoT in the classroom. And I was wondering, you know, if there was 100% parental opt-in or parental consent before turning on the device and starting to use it in the classroom. And if there wasn't, you know, what as a teacher should you do if you don't have 100% parental consent or parental opt-in?
Oh, Sonja, were you about to say, or Sonja, were you about to say something?
If
sorry.
anyone wants,
I'm here.
Oh, for my personal opinion was, if there's any doubt, I wouldn't use it, especially because, for instance, these voice assistants are not COPPA compliant. Kerry, what were you going to add?
So I was going to answer to his first question. I'm sorry, I was muted and I didn't realize it.
No, go ahead.
So so I had already started speaking, but no one could hear me. So, she did get full 100% opt-in from all of the parents. She sent out, as I mentioned, the information about the process she was going to go through ahead of time. And then once the process was through with the students, she shared all of the information that she had shared with the students, with the parents, and then got every single parent except for one came back right away with, you know, appreciation and full approval. The one parent who had questions was primarily concerned about privacy, and she met with that parent face-to-face and explained everything in a little more detail with that parent face-to-face, including the parent had some questions about privacy, but also about the pedagogical benefits, the learning benefits to using the device. And so she had obviously thought all of that out very carefully. They had a conversation. The parent went home, spent a couple more days thinking about it, and then came back with full approval as well. And so she did not plug it in or turn it on until she had that approval. In terms of like what to do without that parent approval, when it comes to brand new technology, I would have to agree with Susan that I wouldn't use it when that student is in the room if there isn't approval from the parent, you know, active approval. It gets a little bit, it's a little bit different when we start talking about devices that are already a part of the way the school functions. And the student is going to the school. I think, for instance, if it's a one-to-one school with iPads, you know, and it's a public school and the student says, I don't want my student to have access to this iPad because I have concerns about, you know, privacy or screen time or whatever it is that they bring up, that presents a much bigger challenge than what we're talking about, because that is a question about that student not getting the same educational experience as their classmates.
Yeah, and this is Sonja. I can speak to that a little bit. You all may know that the Family Policy Compliance Office, which is part of the Department of Ed and works very closely with PTAC, issued a letter to a school in November of 2017 that I know FPF has covered extensively, that found that a school had violated FERPA when it essentially required parents to forfeit their FERPA rights when they signed up for the school's online curriculum. And the reason they had violated FERPA was because the school was not carefully making sure that that curriculum met the school official exception. They weren't making sure that they were controlling the vendor as that exception requires. So just a legal caveat for schools, you do have to carefully make sure that you're meeting that exception. Excuse me, drink water.
I would agree with that. As a leader in this position as CTIO, I really do believe it is my responsibility to work closely with teaching and learning and our legal counsel to make sure that we have those assurances in place with our solution provider.
Well, thank all of you. I actually have to say we have a question here about voice recordings and de-identification, and we're tapping the FPF brain trust a bit. And we pulled Brenda Leong into the room, who is one of the policy counsel here in FPF, who, among many other things, has been doing a lot of great work on de-identification. And I'd like to kind of throw the question to her of whether or not voice recordings could be considered a biometric record under FERPA, and even if they could be de-identified. And if you want to skip the FERPA part, we can skip the FERPA part and maybe have Sonja address that a little bit. But the question of whether or not voice recordings can be de-identified, I want to kind of put that in front of you and see if you have thoughts.
Sure, thanks. So yes, pulled into the room to answer questions and happy to do so. Let me be clear though, I think I was pulled into the room because I have a little bit of knowledge of biometrics, less so about de-identification, except in that context. Just so you don't get too detailed on me because I might get drowning in the details. So voice recordings and biometrics and personal records. Obviously voice is a personally identifiable thing. The question is, as it's collected, how is it maintained and stored, and what is it used for? So not every voice recording is processed through some sort of algorithm or model that is going to, in fact, create a personal record with it. So, for example, the way an Alexa works in your home is it just recognizes voices. It just knows there are voices. And it can actually adapt to those voices over time in the sense of learning how they say certain words or certain phrases and things so that it's better at understanding. But there's no personal record created. It doesn't tie a voice to a person unless you actually go into the settings and set that up and say, I want you, Alexa, to know that I'm me, Brenda, and I want you to have my voice as me tied to my account. And I want to be able to buy things with my voice through you, which means that you have to have my particular personal voice attached to my account, and I have to have a PIN number that I use every time I buy something. So obviously that prevents my teenager from walking into the kitchen and saying, Alexa, you know, buy me every Nintendo game, because it's not my voice, and I have to give it the PIN number as well. So I appreciate that sort of protection. The rest of the voices in my family are more than likely tied to my account, but there's no identifying information on them that identifies who they are and ties them to some other kind of profile. So my teenager who comes in and asks to put things on the grocery shopping list is able to do that, and the account doesn't know that that was this child versus that child or any identifying information. So in terms of how the voice collections are in the school, there might be some applications or programs that collect voice in a way that ties it to a personal record, a particular child or a particular teacher or a particular therapist, whatever that might be. And in that case, it would be personally identifiable information, and almost certainly in that case would fall under school educational record category and FERPA. That there are also apps that use voice activated commands and voice operated opportunities as part of the system and don't collect it as a personally identified information is also probably true. There are probably many categories of things where voice can operate some of the choices or activities on an app or device, and it's not in any way maintained. Now, the real question though is what does that voice qualify for in that case? Because if somebody got that voice file, whether it had any tags on it or not to a particular child or person, it is still a unique voice. And whether they could then match it to other things and identify it via the voice is very dependent on the quality of the recording, the resources that they have, what databases they could match to. But in theory, at least, it is identifiable because the voice is probably unique, unless it's a really poor quality. So that sort of case becomes a lot more gray, and I don't intend to opine on whether that would be an educational record or covered by FERPA. or what other restrictions might be on it. You can't really DID a biometric. I mean, the whole definition of a biometric is that it is collected at a level of specificity that is unique to a person. So in facial recognition, there's things called facial detection or facial characterization that do not collect enough detail to make it personal. They're collecting just enough to know that's a person, and so we want to change the billboard screen. They might collect enough to know that's male or female, older or younger, you know, some other character smiling or not smiling, and so the interactive billboard may choose an ad based on that, but it's not collecting or maintaining a connection to an individual, and the level of detail collected isn't sufficient to identify a particular person. Voice is not, my understanding is voice is not like that. Once you have a voice file, it's the whole voice file. So unless it's just a really low quality, which obviously it could be in some context, it has the potential to be identifiable. So you can't, you know, there may be ways to muffle or blur or do other things to the file that are technological protections that would make it unidentifiable, but that at that point is beyond my particular knowledge. So.
Wow, that's a ton of food for thought. Thank you, Brenda. Really appreciate it. And so because we are running very short on time, I wanted to throw the last question and give the last word to Sonja, and kind of ask, you know, tying this all together, where does kind of the liability lie in terms of who owns devices that are used in classrooms? So if a school authorizes the use of a device or owns a device versus a student, you know, what are the kind of implications of that distinction?
Well, the biggest one I think that at least I'm seeing through policy is the network, the ability to control your own network and whatever you own as the school district is much easier to regulate than items that come in with or without your knowledge to school, personal devices. So you as a district can put all kinds of restrictions on things that are attached to your network, and you can say no devices will be attached to our network unless we give them to you, and then you have all kinds of control. So I think that's where the legal distinction arises. And I got a question even as we're sitting here talking on the webinar about whether there's now more interest at school district level of just saying no personal devices attached to the network. It's cleaner. It does sort of cut off the students from a part of modern life, and you decide whether that's a pedagogical goal or not. But I think that distinction, it's the control factor. I hope that helps.
Absolutely. And just kind of looking at the clock, unfortunately, we are out of time. I'd like to thank each and every one of our speakers for their time and for sharing their wonderful expertise. I'd like to thank each and every one of you for joining us on the call today. I'll follow up with a lot of the information that we discussed with Susan's slides and with recordings of both halves of the webinar. So that way, if you missed anything or if you'd like to go back and hear it again, you can do that. If you have questions as a result of this and you know that are burning that you'd like to follow up with me about or with our speakers about, throw the questions to me. You can just reply to the follow-up email or whatever, and I'll see if I can go get answers for you. So thank you all each again, and we're looking forward to our next conversation. So thank you all and have a wonderful rest of your Thursday.
Thanks.